Hope in the Days of Climate Change. Steve read for us that lovely and rather disturbing, I think in some ways, passage from the prophet Micah. Micah made an appearance from the countryside into Jerusalem to give this harangue to the king and the rulers of Israel. And he actually, at least according to what we know, was pretty successful. Jerusalem was actually not destroyed at that particular point. That happened a few centuries later. But nevertheless, Micah's promise, which is a beautiful, beautiful promise that he ends his speech on, was not fulfilled at that time. And it's interesting as we sort of move our train of thought forward that Jesus kind of picks up the strain of the prophets as he speaks. So we're going to kind of fast forward to Jesus now, and Mark is Jesus that we encounter in Mark goes a little bit more cosmic as he is instructing his disciples not to be misled by any kinds of apocalyptic signs that supposedly portend the end of everything. He tries to interrupt that desire, and I think that we often have that same desire of being able to predict when and what's going to happen. And in particular, the disciples are really, really pressing him on Jesus, who has said he will return in glory, and when that's going to happen. So here is what Jesus says to that small band of powerless, kind of grimy disciple friends of Jesus. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to be on the watch. Therefore, keep awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn. Or else he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. And what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. The word of the risen Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, last week, Jared preached a holy humor sermon on one of what we often call the low Sundays after the high that we experience on Easter Sunday. Now, I'm terrible at telling jokes, so I'm not going to go that route. But I will acknowledge that humor is often the only way to get ourselves through the cultural craziness and the very bleak reality of our poor, suffering earth that is plagued by climate change. As Easter people, we find ourselves living in a sort of confusing trifecta of traumas. A traumatized earth with its rapidly warming oceans and lands, burning forests, looming species extinctions, with desperate refugees who are trying to flee war and famine, and sometimes those events are indeed rooted in the climate crisis. And then thirdly, maybe even finding ourselves as somewhat wounded pandemic survivors, still trying to figure out how to reconnect with one another and with the earth. And this sort of collection of traumas often threatens to overwhelm our current times with fear and despair. It encourages us to engage in wishful fantasies for preserving ourselves and those we love, for showing the strong desire that the disciples experienced as well to stay numb before the problems before us. So Jesus' words to keep awake as they echo in our ears, they probably don't sound all that comforting to us in a lot of ways. Nevertheless, even with this backdrop, we are not the brand of Christians who pray for God alone to take care of the earth, of us, and to leave the rest behind in a burning inferno. Nor do we pray for God to hasten the destruction of God's beloved creation under the guise of transformation. Our post-Easter question is always, how do we keep awake? How do we live into God's vision of a transformed earth? This sort of already happening but not yet accomplished vision that is the hope that we have received in God's resurrection of Jesus. Now, Jesus, of course, was not a climate change activist, but he did have a very deep grasp of our interconnections with one another, our bond with God who loves everything and all things, the earth as imagined by the Hebrew prophets, like we heard Meinke give us that beautiful vision for all to be able to sit under their own fig trees in peace and without fear. So we see this landscape of traumatic events, and we alternate, I think, sometimes between hopelessness and furious attempts to do as much as we can to ward off the worst of the climate crisis. So how many of you out there have electric or hybrid vehicles? A few, yeah. Solar panels on your homes. We haven't done that on the church yet. Oh, we have. I'm sorry. I forgot. We do. Use other energy-saving strategies. Or are you a busy composter working to reduce food waste, an avid recycler? All of us could raise our hands to at least one of those things, I suspect. And so you all know well that we need to adopt renewable energy sources. We need to cut way back on fossil fuels to reduce the carbon dioxide, methane, heat-producing blanket that is around the earth. The very positive response to our newly formed or reformed Earth Care team shows that you don't need to be persuaded that climate change is already unfolding, both locally and globally. But it is real slow going, isn't it? The drive to get to net zero emissions, even by the year 2050, seems like a mirage. The news that we hear about the climate for both people and our creation is often relentless and discouraging. Coming up on our 54th Earth Day, imagine that, 54. Net zero carbon seems like this far-off pipe dream, and we might wonder, how is there hope? The first global conference on climate change took place way back in 1979. I remember that year. Some of you out here do as well. And we're now up to the 28th such conference, held rather ironically, I think, this past year in December in Dubai, the glitzy new United Arab Emirates capital that has literally arisen from the desert thanks to gushers of oil money. The climate change denial movement is still funded in part by fossil fuel companies that are pushing back hard against the scientific evidence of climate devastation. They often drag their feet on renewable energies while they're profiting from the transition that is occurring. So yeah, things are bad. things are difficult. And what if we, sitting out here in Second Presbyterian Church, what if we are not ready, willing, and able to go full-on Greta Thunberg? One of our young, very young, modern-day prophets who regularly demonstrates against the Goliaths of industry and government on behalf of her generation and the earth. Even if your personal efforts to care for our earth seem small and insignificant, hear this good news. Just by sitting in this pew today, you are connected to larger movements of transformation and earth care, both faith-based and secular. So consider the following. First, I'll start with a question. Wouldn't you love to have a backyard, homegrown national park? That sounds cool. You can name it after yourself, right? Favorite person? And there's good news. You can have this if you follow a plan similar to a conservation biologist named Doug Tallamy. He's written a lovely book called Nature's Best Hope, a new approach to conservation that starts in your yard. We can shrink our lawns to transform these green deserts into a more diverse and stable set of biological communities, native shrubs, trees, and flowers that provide year-round habitat for pollinators and decomposers. As we here at Second Pres look toward expanding our own native plantings in this part of our property, we have the opportunity to bring that kind of restoration right here. Second Pres Backyard National Park. And that brings refreshment for ourselves and all the folks who walk by this corner, which is a lot of folks. And we proclaim our solidarity in that way with peoples, indigenous peoples, some of whom have walked softly on this earth for many centuries. That's one good way for us to channel the joy and awe that we receive from visits to our most spectacular national parks. And I'm sure that all of you out there have a favorite. My personal favorite is the Rocky Mountain National Park. And use that energy, that joy, that awe in creating some small oases of native plants right here in the Midwest. In fact, I'm thinking right now of Mary Arney, who has for years planted a riotous, colorful native plant garden. So be like Mary. Taken together, these islands of native plants can make a real difference to the bees and the butterflies, the worms and the beetles that do such beautiful and humble work in our own local space. Let me tell you about another connection that we share as Presbyterians. My own personal background is actually in the earth sciences, though I never worked in the oil and gas industry. I brought a commitment to creation care with me through the decades between that very first Earth Day back in 1970, through my ordination to ministry in 2004, and then continuing through my pastoral career. And along the way, as the chorus of scientific voices warning about climate change grew louder and louder, and that denial movement, often funded by the fossil fuel industry, also gathered steam. For much of that time, the church sort of had its head in the sand. So through some of those years, my voice felt a bit lonely and insignificant. Back in 2015, I helped to plan a conference on climate change and how we should respond as faithful Christians. You want to know where it was? Houston. Yeah, that Houston. Houston, Texas, the very heart of the oil and gas industry. Now, in part, this effort to plan this conference was a bit self-serving because, truthfully, the churches, the Presbyterian churches, and many others in the Synod of the Sun were built by oil and gas money. There's no denying that. And even more, getting our audience to acknowledge the truth of human-caused climate change and pitching the fossil-free, fuel-free future that we needed was going to be a heavy lift, especially in that part of the country. And this was even in the year when Pope Francis published his Laudato Si encyclical, which had kind of given a real boost to the need for the church, the bigger church, to be concerned and involved in our climate crisis. And furthermore, it was also clear that there was a group called Fossil Free PC USA that was going to be pushing hard at the 2016 General Assembly in Portland, Oregon, for complete divestment of PCUSA funds from fossil fuel industries. Sounds easy? Of course not. And our group, as we planned this conference, was trying to lay some middle ground in the hopes of not triggering another mass exodus of churches like we had experienced in the recently ended past over those who were struggling with LGBTQ and IA inclusion. So you can see the landscape here is a bit complicated. But planning this conference was energizing and hopeful. We invited Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is a noted atmospheric scientist and evangelical Christian, to be our keynote speaker, to make the case with us for a robust and urgent involvement of the faith community in the fight against climate change and how we might transform our global economies to more sustainable levels. She gave a compelling presentation, especially focusing on how we find common ground among Christians and also other religious traditions and the common goods that we share with those who both are zealous proponents of climate change activism and those who don't even think it exists. And we aren't there yet, of course, but she is still out there carrying the torch about climate change, reversing it, leading faithful Christians to hear that Micah 4 passage with new ears, bring it to life, and calling us, like Jesus, to keep awake. And through that whole process, I know this is a long story, isn't it? I was introduced to mission responsibility through investment, also known as MRTI. We love acronyms in this church. This is actually a committee of the General Assembly that operates under the Mission Agency Board, advises our Board of Pensions, the Presbyterian Foundation, churches, and even smaller investors on how do our faith values align with our financial investments. Sometimes you might have heard this referred to as socially responsible investing. And I found out recently, our friend Brian Ellison, the Reverend Brian Ellison, who has been in this pulpit, even chaired this committee for about 4 years, back around 2008. But MRTI was actually created back in the 1970s. It came about out of our Reformed theology that God is Lord of all, that there is not just God who operates in some religious sphere and another sphere that's not under God's observation and care. And their efforts first focused on not investing church dollars in things like alcohol, tobacco, and gambling, but over the years they came to include this broader range of products and practices that cause harm to God's beloved community, including the non-human creation. So through MRTI, our denomination collaborates with other faith traditions on behalf of encouraging companies to improve their behaviors. It often operates to propose shareholder resolutions at annual stock meetings, investor meetings, on behalf of environmental justice, on fair labor practices, and so forth. And if they fail to influence the corporate policy over a period of some years, MRTI may recommend that our denomination will divest of its holdings in those offending companies or companies. It's kind of a last resort if constructive engagement fails. Such a tactic, for example, resulted in global pressure to end apartheid in South Africa back in the 1990s. Focuses today on climate change. So as we sit here in these pews, and many of us have investments, I would like to say to you that if your personal green thumb is more of a greenback generator, you might want to keep tabs on MRTI's investment work in this very complicated and changing financial landscape. So like Earth Day itself, MRTI has recently turned 50, and their work continues. And it is beautiful work. It engages many marginalized communities now, a voice that has often been not heard by corporations. And so I would urge you to look them up. Think about what they're doing. We heard a wonderful talk in Sunday school a couple weeks ago, Nicolette Zimmerman, whose work is involved in the corporate world, doing coaching of corporations who are trying to achieve their sustainability goals and how that can come to fruition. So there are lots of ways to engage our corporate systemic environment that we may not have thought of previously. Another intersection of climate change with environmental justice work is illustrated by a project called Project Drawdown. And this project actually calculates how much carbon emissions can be reduced in different spheres of human activity. So they have energy and building structures and transportation, etc. But one of the most unexpected ways to draw down carbon, and it's significant, is girls' education. Now that seems like a bit of a stretch, doesn't it? But think about it this way. More educated women and girls who control their reproductive health have fewer children, and they are better able to lead their communities in agricultural and entrepreneurial enterprises, thereby reducing carbon emissions and promoting community resilience. Our One Great Hour of Sharing offerings support projects like this through Self-Development of Peoples or the Presbyterian Hunger Program. In fact, Second Presbyterian's support of the Pakistan Education Board, we've heard Vita Gill speak from this very same pulpit, is a great way for us to participate in raising up the future of thousands of women and girls. So if your passion lies in this area, know that you are participating in climate change work. One last thing. Last week, I discovered the PBS series. It's called A Brief History of the Future. That's a catchy title. In which the host, his name is Ari Wallach, he's a descendant of Holocaust survivors. He's what's called a futurist. Who knew this was a career, right? Hey, Mom, hey, Dad, I'm going to be a futurist. Another example of how God gets the last laugh for us. Anyway, he is focusing in this series on global efforts to build sustainable futures in a stunning variety of projects that they profile in this series. The first one that really caught my attention was a group in the jungles of North India. They are practicing what's a very ancient art of constructing root bridges. Okay. Root bridges composed of roots woven all together to get you across the chasms instead of concrete bridges. Who knew? Connecting people who otherwise wouldn't be connected without using harmful technology. And then they go from there to the Moroccan desert, where they're building the world's largest solar array for providing renewable energy. So we see this sort of movement across the church traditions, across secular organizations, other faith traditions sort of bubbling up, finding so many ways in which humans can bring our God-given creativity to problem solving this with this huge, huge impending climate crisis. And yet, we can't do it all, but we can do something. So in case you have lost the thread of what in the world does all this have to do with ourselves, as Easter people, as those of us sitting in these pews today, remember that what we are seeking is how we can stay afloat in hope in the tumultuous rapids of life that threaten to upend our tiny little boats. We are seeking hope in an environment that seems to hold only despair for us. Now, there are a lot of facets to what Jesus' resurrection can mean, and I think Jared has fleshed out a few in the last several weeks as we've been moving through this Easter season. But I would like to encourage us today to think about Jesus' resurrection as God's "yes, we can" message. It's a message that points us towards God's future of love and justice, and it's a message which we discover already unfolding in us and in so much around us that is wonderful and life-giving, like family camp and like committee work at all kinds of levels. As Easter people, we proclaim that God has so foolishly but wonderfully placed trust in all that is small and weak so that we can move through death to new life. Friends, we do not entirely control that future, nor can we abandon our work toward it. So we trust in that future and go about our work, small or large, not knowing how necessarily or even how much it will bear good fruit for the well-being of future generations. I refer us back to the prophet Micah, who did give us that incredibly beautiful, grounded, and really quite local vision for all of us of what constitutes a beautiful life in God and community, where all have homes, where all have food, where everyone has a tree to sit under, and where all live without fear. And then Jesus calling us to alertness through all our days, through here on earth, caring for our earth home and those who live upon it, calling us to enact that future until it becomes a full reality in God's time. So friends, we're called to find our people, those who love creation, to connect with them, whether that's in person, in these pews, whether that's virtually. What we do here at Second matters. We are called to find joy in that effort. That earthworm emerging from the soil that so astounded my 5-year-old granddaughter. We are finding joy in the relationships that we weave as we labor together, and called to constantly remind one another that we are all beloved children of the God of the universe. Nothing is too small. All is included. All is necessary. So may it be so for all of us, even, or maybe perhaps especially, in these days of climate change. Amen.